This video is brought to you by Blessed Be God Boutique, maker of Catholic fashionable apparel, handmade accessories, and more. Fridays are days when politicians typically release stories to the public that they just don't want reported widely. This is true in secular politics as well as in the internal politics of the Catholic Church. Friday, it came out that in Rome, a dinner party was held with EWTN executives and the Cardinal Secretary of State of all people, Pietro Parolin, who is sometimes called the Vice Pope. Through smiles and the language of the gospel, Cardinal Parolin accused EWTN of fomenting schism. EWTN was used as a stand-in for the traditionalist movement more broadly, which is based mostly out of the United States for various reasons, or at least that's the wide perception. And one of those reasons being our culture just being entitling us to speak out about whatever we want, or so we feel. But this attack came at the same time that Raymond Arroyo was interviewing Bishop Athanasius Schneider, who is, for my money, the best of the bishops in the church who are outside of the SSPX. Arroyo, in particular, has gotten under the skin of the Modernists in Rome, as we'll see when we go over the talk Parolin gave at that dinner party, where, again, he warned EWTN not to cause schism. This is an attack on EWTN, which many influential voices have called for being shut down entirely by the local bishop and by Rome, or having the network taken over and brought in line. But again, EWTN is a stand-in for all the voices that you watch on YouTube and listen to in podcasts, warning of the crisis in the church and the gross errors of this and previous papal claimants since the council. So let's have a look at this story, because this is worth going over to. The attack on EWTN is not only an attack on EWTN. Pay close attention to the language employed here. It's an attack on what the Vatican perceives as the traditionalist, rigid resistance to Francis and his program of remaking the Catholic Church. EWTN is, to be clear, not a traditionalist outlet. Far from it. EWTN is at best described as a moderate Novus Ordo outlet, with some conservative Novus Ordo figures like Raymond Arroyo, the Papal Posse, and Father Mitch Pacwa. But for the radical modernists in Rome, it's all the same thing. A resistance to the building of the ape of the church, and for whatever reason, one of the epicenters of that resistance is in the United States, as well as in France and in a couple of other places. I was made aware of this story when a very pro-Francis journalist named Christopher Lamb shared it on Twitter, but the story comes from VaticanNews.va with this headline: Parolin to EWTN. Truth distinguishes information from communication. Cardinal Secretary of State Pietro Parolin speaks at the EWTN dinner in Frascati on Wednesday evening. We publish here the full text of his reflections under the theme, "The truth is what distinguishes information from communication." Now, know something here. The word communication could be swapped out for the word propaganda, and you get the real meaning of what Cardinal Pietro Parolin is saying here. Now, it's worth noting, Parolin isn't exactly a model of virtue in the Vatican. Far from it, actually. Cardinal Parolin has been implicated in Cardinal Becciu's financial mess, including trying to use his position of authority to sweep the whole thing under the rug. And his involvement in all of that, and the fact that he's not under any real scrutiny, does feed the rumor that Becciu is the fall guy here. Now, keep all that in mind. The article is a full-text address from Cardinal Parolin to a Vatican dinner party in which EWTN officials were present, and it's actually really short. I'll have it broken up here for you in full, though. From the article, quote, "The truth is a crucial theme for professionals in the field of communications, such as yourselves. It's an issue which in these past years has become even more prominent in public debate, due to both the spread of the phenomena of false news as well as of a type of communication, often based on a distorted or false representation of the other. This is a type of fanaticism grounded in the conviction that the truth that one believes is so absolute as to legitimize the destruction of another person, what communications experts term character assassination. This is done in order to impose one's own view of truth upon everyone else. Instead, as John Paul II observed in his message for the 35th World Day for Peace, quote, even when the truth has been reached, and this can only happen in a limited and imperfect way, it can never be imposed. Much less, therefore, can one's own distorted representation of truth be imposed. As Christians, then, and this is certainly true for communications professionals, perception of truth is not limited to a horizontal perspective, related merely to our social lives. there is a much more profound dimension. Truth for us Christians is a person, the person of Jesus Christ, who, as St. Paul says, holds all things together. See St. Paul's letter to the Colossians, chapter 1, verse 17. It is this encounter that ensures that communication does not remain simply a profession which conveys information, but that understands and sets this responsibility within a broader horizon than the albeit importantly dissemination of news. It is in this encounter woven by love for the other that creates that unity which holds all things together. Here I would like to recall what your founder, Mother Angelica, used to say, quoting Mother Angelica here, "It is our duty to speak the truth, and each person can either assume or not assume this duty. But the truth must above all be within us." We should always keep this statement in mind and have the same awareness. The truth does not belong to us. We serve the truth, and we can serve it only in love and in unity. We are its custodians, not its owners. The truth is in us if we are humble and have the courage to know how to welcome it, even if at times it does not present itself as we might expect. End quote. He's not wrong in a lot of that. It's just how he's using the truth here. Well, you hear there is a framing of this in two things. In the language of the faith and in Mother Angelica's fidelity to the church and the faith. Now, here's the thing. Mother Angelica is well known for having smashed the radical modernists in various shows for EWTN. You could go look up some of her videos if you've never watched her. She got radicalized. She became a radical resistance figure herself. But they're co-opting her for their message against EWTN and the traditionalists overall. They're setting this up to claim that EWTN has elements within the organization and in America more broadly who spread news that isn't real, that push false narratives, and that these stories sow division against the Roman pontiff. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's an awful lot like what our secular adversaries say, too. EWTN is on the verge of schism, according to them, like apparently many of us are, in that we defy what they call the magisterium of Francis of the Roman pontiff, which is an odd turn of phrase that I've only ever heard in our time, and I've never seen in historic Catholic documents before. I've never heard of a magisterium of a particular papal claimant. But Parolin is really hitting this hard at a dinner where EWTN execs are the guest. He's putting them on notice. Quote, "First of all, as Pope Francis has indicated many times, we can witness to this through our style of communication. In a message to the members of the Catholic Press Association in June of 2020, the pontiff invited American Catholic media outlets to work for communion, even more so today. Quote, in an age marked by conflicts and polarization from which the Catholic community itself is not immune. We need media," the Pope continued, "capable of building bridges, defending life and breaking down the walls, visible and invisible, that prevent sincere dialogue and truthful communication between individuals and communities. If we truly believe that, quote, we are members one of another, as St. Paul exhorts us, see his letter to the Ephesians, chapter 4, verse 25, we must then, quote, lend the ear of the heart towards others without prejudice or exclusion. To borrow John Henry Newman's, quote, motto, our communication should speak heart to heart. A large international news network like EWTN that invokes the gospel message is therefore called to promote understanding between people, dialogue between communities, and the search for places and opportunities that create consent between distant worlds, sometimes in conflict with each other. What the Apostle Peter asked of the first believers in the risen Christ 2,000 years ago is particularly relevant today, especially for those who carry out a task such as yours. Quoting St. Peter now, always be ready to give an explanation to anyone who asks you for a reason for your hope. But he adds, do so with gentleness and reverence. See the first letter of St. Peter, chapter 3, verses 14 to 17. These words were certainly well known to your founder. Again, quoting Mother Angelica. You cannot go to heaven hating someone, Mother Angelica maintained. Forgive now. Be compassionate now. Be patient and grateful now. The means of communication, even more so if they purport to highlight their Catholic identity, must strive not to spread hate, but rather to promote a non-hostile communication. The truth and the values deriving from it must be fearlessly upheld. This proclamation, however, should be formulated in a merciful style by those who patiently listen to the women and men of our time, who walk with them, even making themselves the interpreters of their suffering and their concerns. Quote, communication contains the root communion. Communion is in the DNA of communication and is fundamentally its greatest aspiration. A communication that instead fans the flames of polarization or builds walls instead of breaking them down, betrays its very nature. The proclamation of the truth cannot be separated from the exercise of charity. John Paul II already advocated this in his message for the 35th World Communication Day, when, echoing Communio et Progressio, published 20 years earlier, he observed that, quote, if the media are to be effective means of fellowship and genuine human advancement, they must be channels and expressions of truth, justice, and peace, goodwill and active charity, mutual help, love, and communion. End quote. I'll get back to Cardinal Parolin in a moment. EWTN is being put on notice. Communion is a very, very loaded word in the church right now. Unrepentant public sinners are being allowed Eucharistic communion by Rome, despite their cardinals and their bishops, their local ordinaries, saying that they are not to receive the Eucharist for fear of losing their own souls, while Cardinal Parolin is telling EWTN here that they are at risk of not being in communion with the alleged Roman pontiff because they do what precisely? In reality, they tell the truth. Parolin is accusing them of spreading false news, of sowing division. He's talking very specifically here about Raymond Arroyo, who is the biggest offender, and his interviews with Cardinal Mueller just a few days ago, and then more recently with Bishop Athanasius Schneider, and I'll get to him in a moment. But here's the final bit from Cardinal Parolin. He's being very subtle here, in that classic Vaticanista kind of way. Quote, I would like to conclude with something particularly close to my heart. Catholic media, as you well know, has an important role in the task of the new evangelization. This is why it's good that they feel they are an active part of the life of the Church. First of all, by living in a spirit of communion with the Bishop of Rome. This is all the more urgent today in a time marked by overly dramatic debates, also within the Church, which do not even spare the person and the magisterium of the Roman pontiff. When Mother Angelica founded EWTN with tremendous courage and extraordinary creativity, she did so primarily to provide an instrument of good at the service of the Church and the Pope. This continues to be your greatest mission and reward, to be and to experience yourselves at the servants of the Church and the successor of Peter. As St. John Paul II stated, recalling Jesus' prayer for Peter, see the Gospel of Luke chapter 22, verse 31, the mission entrusted to him by Jesus concerns the Church as it extends through the centuries and through human generations. See the General Audience of December 1992. The devil always seeks to sift us like wheat, but Jesus' prayer to Peter and his successors is our anchor of salvation. May the spirit of communion with the Pope be the distinctive sign of your work. May this be, quote, felt and, quote, touched in your television broadcasts as well as in your articles and in your multimedia programs. May every one of your viewers or readers recognize EWTN as a work of God at the service of the truth, ecclesial communion, and the good of humanity, end quote. In other words, stop questioning Francis. Be in communion with the magisterium of Francis, whatever that means. In plain English, that means they are equating the bizarre and heretical things Francis pushes with the office of the Roman pontiff itself. So the message to EWTN, and by extension to all of us questioning what is going on, is this. You're being schismatic. Stop it. Submit to Francis and his false church. That's what the message is. Cardinal Parolin is an expert in making these political threats sound very Catholic, because he's the Cardinal Secretary of State, has been serving in that post for many years. And he sometimes just gets called the Vice Pope. And trust me, he's got designs on the papacy itself. Just to give you an idea of his influence here. So now, EWTN has been on the radar for the Modernists in Rome for a long time, and are conceived as being the spiritual leaders of the Recognize and Resist movement in America, which is honestly pretty funny. Raymond Arroyo does good work, but he is far more moderate than most of the people you watch on YouTube, including people who are not Recognize and Resist and are just conservative Novus Ordo with strong opinions. He's more moderate than them, that's for sure. But he gets big-name figures like Cardinal Gerhard Mueller to come on and tell the truth about the state of the Church, like in his infamous hostile takeover talk recently. Or like in this story, where Bishop Athanasius Schneider came on to comment on Cardinal Mueller's recent infamous interview, where again he called the Synod on Synodality a hostile takeover of the Church. Bishop Schneider's words here are worth looking at briefly because not only are they true in themselves, useful for us in this struggle with Rome, but it shows what the modernists are worried about more broadly, and why they went after EWTN at a swanky Vatican dinner party. So instead of me just quoting Bishop Schneider, I think you can handle with him talking here. Here's a short clip and a short excerpt from that Raymond Arroyo interview with Bishop Schneider.
Your Excellency, thanks for being here. I want to start with some important news. It was announced earlier this week that Pope Francis has extended the final phase of this synod on synodality by another year. So that means there will be 2 sessions, one in October of 2023 and yet another in October of 2024. Pope Francis explained himself this way: I hope that this decision will favor the comprehension of synodality as a constitutive dimension of the Church and help everyone to live it as a journey of brothers and sisters who witness to the joy of the gospel. Your Excellency, what is meant by a constitutive dimension of the Church, and what do you make of this 1-year extension?
The constitutive element of the Church is first given by God, and this is the faithful unchanging transmission of the deposit of faith, of the Catholic truth to all generations. And the Synod, as always the Church understood, is a mean to guarantee the faithful transmission of faith, and also the Synod was also always understood in the Church and practiced as a means to condemn heresies and to defend the flock of the faithful from the poison of ambiguity, of heresies, and of scandals. This is the aim of a synod, as the Church always understood. And now, this, what we currently are witnessing here, this so-called synodality, with these discussions, it is a misuse of the concept of the word of synod, and in my opinion, even an abuse of this word for an agenda, to arrive an agenda to undermine, to make more ambiguous the Catholic faith, and to adapt it to the wishes and the fashions of our day. This is evidently ever more now known as the final goal of this whole process of synodality.
So the bishop goes on to say that he agrees 100% with Cardinal Mueller's assessment that the synod is a hostile takeover of the Church. This has earned him and EWTN some pushback, with all the typical modernist voices sharing the National Catholic Reporter's story about Cardinal Parolin's words at that dinner. One example of this comes from Massimo Fascioli, one of Francis's voices in America among the left Catholic intelligentsia, who on Twitter characterized that interview with Bishop Schneider as, quote, defiance from Raymond Arroyo. Elsewhere, we see figures like professional Francis fanfiction writer Austin Ivere, who claim that EWTN and, by extension, all the traditional commentators that you watch or listen to, are erecting a wall between Rome and the Church in America, which is a fancy way of accusing us of promoting schism with Rome, and, quite frankly, grossly inflating our reach by orders of magnitude. I could go on, but this video is already long enough as it is. I'll leave it there with this question. What does Cardinal Parolin and the Modernists aim here? Surely the Modernists in apostate Rome know that EWTN's audience isn't actually that big, even just among Catholics. Surely they know that in the grand scheme of things in the Church in America, most Catholics aren't actually paying any attention whatsoever to the voices of dissent to what is going on in Rome. Surely they have to know that, or they're being completely delusional and worrying about a threat to their power that is actually, in all reality, far smaller and less significant than they realize. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Or maybe they really are just focused on the equivalent of phantoms. Maybe they really are just chasing shadows. Let me know what you think of all this, please, in the comments. And like and subscribe if you haven't. It really does help. As does sharing this on social media. That helps a lot as well. As always, pray for the Church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.